Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy is sponsored by Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with the intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Products include Westlaw, Practical Law, and Firm Central legal practice management software for small law firms. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. Federal Credit Union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the Greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is Life Illuminated. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan, acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. A Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology. Look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
Good day and welcome to Access to Democracy. I'm Stephen Blair Venable, your guest host today, sitting in for the incomparable Alan Miller, who I should say has made this show what it is. We have a fascinating and accomplished gentleman with us today, Russel Belanger, who is a lifetime resident of the Rondo neighborhood and has started an organization called the Circle of Peace Movement. I should say this is quite interesting because what Russel has done is he has successfully shown that gang members of rival gangs can be brought together over a meal, and that after several meetings, they tend to declare a truce, and they build lifelong bonds. Now keep in mind, we have community stakeholders across the nation, policymakers, intellectuals, all kinds of people trying to solve these sorts of social ills, and they haven't had much success. But Russel Belanger has proven it can be done. Russel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Stephen.
So the Circle of Peace Movement, this was started in 2010?
In March of 2010.
March of 2010.
It was actually in February of 2010, I was in a board meeting and I noticed that the snow was beginning to melt, and what registered in my mind is that the shooting was going to start in the community, the Rondo community that I live in.
Yes.
It had been happening for a number of years, and my grandchildren had been getting into some things that I wasn't quite sure what was going on with them, but it seems like I wasn't seeing them that often, and I'd gotten the word that my oldest grandson had been shot on 2 different occasions in his arm. And that thought that February day was that I needed to do something, or we might be looking at a funeral.
Of your grandson?
Of my grandson,
Yes.
And it could be someone else's grandson, someone else's child.
Yes.
I thought that I would just take this thing on, and I was more upset than afraid. And what I did is I began to ask questions about what was going on with them, and pretty soon a name came up that I could go to the neighborhood and ask, do you know this kid? And then someone would say, well, yeah, that's so-and-so's grandchild.
Yes.
And then I found my way to their door, and after a conversation, someone else's name would come up.
Yes.
And then I'd find my way to them. And in a week's time, I was able to find family members from 6 different families that represented 6 different gangs. I told them that we needed to sit down and have a conversation, that we could all be looking at funerals.
Yes.
And at first they said they didn't want to come, they didn't want to see the other people that were going to be there. And I persisted, and they accepted. My wife Sarah and I talked about this for some time. She cooked a meal. We talked to, we sought out a church that we frequented, and they said they welcomed us to come there.
Yes.
And sit in what is called the center room, which is in the center of the church. There's no windows, and it provided some safety for those that showed up.
Yes.
When they came together, the finger pointing started. Your kid shot up my house. Your kid beat up my daughter. The police are always coming around looking to see if they can see your kid around, and on like that. And I stopped and I said, we're going to have some rules. And it all started with what's called a circle process. I sat everybody in a circle. We had a talking piece, and we began to ask everyone what was important to them that be included in these rules. And number 1 was you had to have the talking piece to speak. No put downs. We gave everybody 2 minutes at a time to speak. Everyone would be equal in that circle. No one's voice would be stronger than another's. There are 10 rules in all, and I can't zip them off the top of my head, but they're the same rules that we use today. And we are about to celebrate our 300th circle.
That is absolutely amazing. You know, I should say, for the benefit of the viewing audience, you and I got together for coffee just to get to know each other before the interview. And one of the things you said really, really struck me, and I think this is sort of an important insight about human beings, all human beings. I was saying to you that in this world of policymakers and intellectuals and community stakeholders who are engaged in this national discussion about what we do about some of these social ills, I've sort of marveled at what you've been able to do. And I asked you the question, what is the secret? And correct me if I'm wrong, you essentially said, everybody needs to eat and everybody wants to tell their story. Is that about what it boils down to?
It's pretty much that. And it's if you stand back and take a look at what's happening in a situation, it doesn't always have to be rocket science to fix something. I looked and I realized that these kids did belong to us.
Yes.
They belong to all of us.
Yes.
It wasn't a situation that you needed to bring the city or the police or the county, the different systems in. These are our children.
Yes.
They're our community members. So as I grew up, and there were 6 of us in my family, brothers and sisters. When something happened in that house and we weren't handling things as we should, my mother would sit down and she would say, "What's your take on this?"
Right.
And she'd go around in that circle. So it seemed very simple to me that we just needed to be able to talk to each other.
That makes so much sense to me because as a person on the outside looking in, so many times when I hear a story about whether it's gang violence or a person who's had a run-in with the police officer, you hear people say, "I felt disrespected. No one was listening." And it strikes me, even as a lawyer, that, you know, for example, a lot of people say, we live in such a litigious society. I can tell you from my personal experience as a lawyer, a lot of that litigation would never happen if people got a chance to tell their story and they got the apology, which is really at the base of the litigation. I think a lot of people are harmed. They're harmed by other people. They're harmed by representatives of the government. They're harmed by corporate entities. And what they really want oftentimes is for someone to say, I harmed you, I was wrong, and I'm very sorry. And it just strikes me that a part of your model is simply giving everybody a chance to say, this is who I am, this is why I feel the way I feel, and this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Does that accurately reflect?
Everyone has their story. And in that story, it will tell you something about that person that you didn't know.
Right.
And then and that leads the way to understanding. When I saw some of these families begin to explain what their story was all about, it made it plain that they were never meant to hurt any of these people that were in that room.
Right.
They began to tell stories about the police and what had happened, and the police had come to their door and come in and walked over the toes of their shoes, looking for somebody that they could see was not there. I asked them then, the very first meeting, we need to bring the police here.
Yes.
So they can hear your story and we can start a new relationship. Everybody said, oh no, we don't want the police. They put the handcuffs on me one night. Everybody had their story about the police.
Right.
And I asked that group to come for 4 Mondays in a row, just so that we could talk this thing out. Each Monday, I asked them, can we bring the police in so we can start a different relationship?
Yes.
It was very emotional when that point came up. At the end of 4 circles, the group said, we have to keep meeting. We need to keep meeting. And by the way, they were hugging each other goodbye at that point. It took 25 circles before they said, okay, bring the police in.
That's amazing. That lack of trust is very deep.
It was very deep. And when the police came in, the chief came, the deputy chief, the homicide commander, the gang commander, there were a few others, and they came in, they sat down, and we read them the rules.
Yes.
And they were more than glad to follow those rules.
Yes.
Some of the stories that the police told about their life and their families made everyone there see them as human beings.
Yes.
The police could see these people as they were no longer thugs to them, they were people they knew. They talked about some of the things that had happened to them with the police, and the police made things right. They were able to go back and straighten out some things that were in a record that shouldn't be.
Right.
They gave out their business cards. So now, when these people had a problem, they didn't dial 911. They dialed their friend's number.
Right. And so now you're, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one of the women in the group, the police had shown up regularly to her door, and when they were looking for somebody that might be affiliated with the gang that her son had been involved in, she would open the door and they would just walk in, and there'd be a group of them. They'd walk through her house and they were making life miserable. She had to move on several occasions because the caretaker and the landlord didn't want them in there because of all this police involvement. This one night she called this officer that she had gotten his business card.
Yes.
And said, the police are at my door right now and they want to come in. He got on the telephone, he called, and those officers dispersed and left her house, and they have yet to come back.
Which is proof positive that the universe does ultimately run on relationships.
That's right.
And it's an extraordinary thing to hear. I think about your own personal life story. when I was getting to know you, the thing that was so interesting to me is the thing that everyone knows about you, which is the Circle of Peace movement. But I think your life story provides a valuable context for the story that is yours. It sort of answers the question, how did you become Russel Belanger? One of the things that I think has probably given you the level of insight that you've had into what happens in these urban neighborhoods, and Rondo in particular. You've been there all your life. You were there when they ran the freeway through the Rondo neighborhood with all of the fallout. You had to essentially take a small payment for your house, or at least your parents did, a payment that wasn't sufficient to buy another house. Can you take us back to that time? What was that like? And I think you had a run-in with the police when you were 7 years old. Take us back to that, please.
Stephen, I was very lucky, a very lucky young man to grow up in the time that I did. I was there, I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and we lived in that, in the lot that is now part of 94, Highway 94, the freeway. And there came a time that we were off of that land, and we were given, as you said, much less money than was expected. I was just a kid then. Our family actually were split up amongst other relatives for a time while we found a home. We didn't have housing laws then, so it wasn't like you could go and move to Highland Village or any distance away from where you lived, because that was the black community.
Right.
That's where you were going to live.
Right.
My mother found a home that was actually 4 blocks up the street from Rondo, and that was a little further than most of the others
Right.
had moved. Most people moved right next to where they used to live. At that time, the neighborhood or the street that we moved into was all white. And they didn't allow the kids to play together because of the racial difference.
So you had to stay on the black side of the divide.
Well, yeah, basically, I had to stay in my yard.
Wow.
There was a lot that went around the block that was kind of a vacant lot. And I and some of my friends would go up there, and pretty soon some of the other kids found their way up there. They would go around the block one way, we'd go around the other, and we began to play together.
Yes.
We knew when we were done, they would go back home around
Right.
one way, we would go the other way, and nobody was the wiser. But one day we had an especially good time. We were playing baseball, and we played all day long. And we all came home together. We forgot that we weren't supposed to be friends. And you should have seen the parents come running out of the house, and they just really felt like they didn't know what they were going to do. It was also a time when the families were beginning to move.
Right.
White flight. So we saw the neighborhood change a great deal. I was lucky to have, my father worked for the railroad, and my mother also worked. And after from the stress I feel of that move, being forced to leave Rondo, my father had a series of strokes and ended up in a nursing home, and then my mother had all of us to take care of. She's a very strong woman, and I would even remember she would come home from her job, she would fix dinner, and sometimes she'd take her robe, her apron off, and walk around the block, a couple blocks, to Mr. Miller's butcher shop,
Yes.
where they began to organize what would be called the North Central Voters League. Later, they would take it to the next level of Target Area A, and that became Ramsey Action Programs, so which is now called CASH.
Yes.
It's one of our largest agencies. So in order to get things done, I had someone that would show me, this is what you need to do in order to get things done. And it wasn't about calling someone else and seeing if they could do it for you.
Right. You know, it's interesting when we, as African American men, talk to other African American men who have done extraordinary things, and sometimes just men who have survived some very difficult circumstances. One of the things that you often hear is of an extraordinary mother. And by all accounts, your mother was a force of nature, running the Urban League, being so civically engaged, being the watchful, protective mother that she was. And so you actually have memories in your own living room of having Hubert Humphrey sitting there to talk to your mom, and Fritz Mondale?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
My mother, from early on, I have pictures of as diverse racially a group in our living room on St. Anthony,
Yes.
where that freeway runs now. My mother would say to me, as late as the 60s, when I was running around with my fist balled up, and she would tell me, she said, it's not a black world, it's not a white world, it's your world. And
That's beautiful. That's empowering.
she had many things that she would share with us as with my brothers and sisters, and all of them had a hand in raising me.
Yes.
So I was very lucky kid that way. She was involved in how people were going to be able to vote and who needed to be in these offices. She knew that all of this began at those early levels, not just for the presidency, but you needed to know who the judges were going to be, and you needed to be involved in that decision. So she met people, she brought them to our home. We all had jobs in there to keep that home as it should be, to receive guests. My job was to be in that, keep that yard as it should be. I had a sister that was to handle all the glass in the home and
Yes.
that type of thing.
That is amazing. Now, at 7 years old, you had an unfortunate run-in with the police. Can you briefly tell us about that?
Well, as I said, we lived on Dayton Avenue, which is right up the street from Rondo. And as I said, at that time, the area was all white. Selby Avenue at the time was a place that you didn't see black people. My mother told me when she was leaving for work one morning, she said, and I was at home on vacation from school with my brothers and sisters, she'd say, I'm going to work now, and I don't want you to leave the block. And I want you to stay off Selby. Well, she knew I was a curious kid, and she would always give me warnings about what I shouldn't be doing. But as she drove off that day, I knew I was going up there to see what was on Selby Avenue. And I walked up there, and I crossed the street and started down Selby Avenue, and I got about 2 blocks, and the police pulled over and told me I should get up against the wall, put my hands up against the wall. And I can tell you, I was so small and so skinny that I remember they could only get 2 fingers in my pockets to search me, and then told me to go home. The first thing that came to my mind is that I was going to tell my mother, but then I remembered that she told me not to go up there, so I had to keep that secret for many years.
Yes, indeed.
But I never forgot that that happened. There are a number of things that when I see young people now ending up in juvenile facilities, and they've been traumatized.
Yes.
And the only thing that that has been proven about the value of those facilities is that there's one common thing that all of those kids have is most of them end up in an adult facility.
You know, Russell, one of the things that so resonates with me, coming back to the present and the Circle of Peace movement, you've been honored by the St. Paul Foundation, really a powerhouse as far as community foundations go, and actually they're a former client of mine. You've been celebrated by the police department. You've been celebrated by community stakeholders of all types. And one of the things that resonates with me is I think about the word circle, your use of the word circle in the Circle of Peace movement. In many ways, your life has come full circle. Born into the Rondo neighborhood, having seen untold levels of strife and misfortune and change and racism. You have an unfortunate run-in with the police at 7 years old. And here you are today, having founded this extraordinary organization that I think has received several grants from the St. Paul Foundation.
Yes.
And you have brought the police and judges and gang members and community members together, and starting out as a 7-year-old kid who's traumatized by the police, you are now a recipient of the Chief's Award from the chief of the St. Paul Police Department, and are being celebrated with a person who has directly brought about a decrease in gang violence. And that is a very, very extraordinary life. And I guess we've got about a minute and a half left. If you were talking to a young person right now who was trying to sort of extract the great lessons of life from a man with your story, with your insight, with your experience, and your accomplishments, can you tell me a couple of things that you might offer that person?
Well, in the time that we have, I guess I would say, during Circle, we have kids in there too, and I've watched them find their voice.
Yes.
And if they can find their voice and they can learn to listen, I think that's key to how they will move forward in life. If they will be able to see that this life is their life, and they can speak about what they'd like to see happen with it, I think that there's more opportunity than they're aware of.
Yes, indeed. And so here in the city of St. Paul, where you work and where you live, what does the future hold in about 25 seconds?
What we're working on now is we want to see these juvenile facilities closed as we know them. We're hoping that we can see small group homes where we can take children that are finding that they have a problem and help fix that problem and give them the same opportunities that many others have, so that they may be able to do something that will that they know that their community can be proud of.
An extraordinary vision. Thank you so much for being on Access to Democracy. It was a joy to interview you, and quite frankly, it's an honor to know you. Well, that's it today, folks, for Access to Democracy. Once again, I'm Stephen Blair Venable, sitting in for the incomparable Alan Miller. We'll see you next time.